So I've been interested in this problem for a while, and I've been working on it the last couple of years. And the problem that I see with subjective theories is a problem that a lot of people have pointed out, which is that on this kind of view, it doesn't really explain Jesus' death. Like, why is that so important to atonement? If he's just kind of a moral example for us, he could very well do that without dying, right? So his death doesn't seem very well explained in those views. And on the objective views, you've got this ransom view that says that Satan has some rights against God. That doesn't seem very plausible to a lot of people. On the penal substitution view, you've got to say that Jesus is punished for us. And for that to work, you've got to say that other people could suffer punishment for me, and that would somehow make me right with the victim of my sins. But that seems morally pretty problematic. I mean, we don't allow that in our everyday lives. It's not like if somebody's convicted of murder and they confess to it. It's not like their mom could come in and say, "Oh, I don't want my son to die, and here, I will suffer, the lethal injection on his behalf." But that's ridiculous. You can't do that, right? That certainly wouldn't fulfill his debt to society. It wouldn't help him to atone for his wrongdoing. So the penal substitution view seems built on a false assumption. The satisfaction view is interesting, but again, it has some questions. Why is the death so important? Why is that so key to offering some sort of reparation or fulfilling our moral debts to God? There's still some, I think, questions about how that's supposed to work. So each of these views face some challenges, and so I've been trying to develop an understanding of the atonement that'll deal with these challenges. And there's really two main elements to the view that I've been working on. First is that I think that when we atone for our wrongdoings, what we do depends a lot on the context of our relationship with the person that we've wronged. Depends on the context of our society, what is regarded as sort of an adequate atonement. And so I think this is important because Jesus, if he atones for our sin, is doing it in a Jewish context. And in the Jewish context, humans atone through sacrifices. They brought animals, really the best example of the animal that they had, and they brought it to the temple and offered that as an offering to God that deals with their sin. And so in that context, where humans are regularly offering these, and there's a yearly sacrifice called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where a lamb is slaughtered and then another one is sent off into the wilderness to deal with the whole sins of Israel. So in that context, it makes sense for those people that sins are dealt with through a sacrifice. And so I think whatever Jesus is going to do in that context is going to somehow draw on that tradition of sacrifice. And I think that helps to make sense of why his death is involved, because his death is then in a way sort of mimicking or being a kind of sacrifice, saying, look, what I'm doing is what those things were doing, those other sacrifices. So I think that's part of the view. The other part of the view that I've been working on is this. What sins exactly is he atoning for? Is he atoning for my sins, your sins, the sins of individuals? Typically in the past, theories of atonement have been thinking that way, that Jesus atones for just lots of individual sins. So every individual's sins are now dealt with. But I think actually, if we think a little differently and think of Jesus as atoning for collective sins, that is the sin of a collective body, a community, that I think is going to help resolve a lot of these problems, because now when Jesus atones, he's functioning as a representative of this collective or community that has sinned. And it makes sense, if a collective has sinned, that a representative could act on behalf of that collective to atone for the sins of that collective. So let's take an example. Imagine you've got a company who's polluted the environment. They've broken a bunch of laws in polluting. This comes to light. They should atone for this, the company should. How can they do it? Well, there's lots of ways of doing it, but it doesn't have to be that each individual that was somehow involved has to do something. No, the company could just do something as a whole, and it could have representatives that do that on their behalf. So you could have the president of the company that says, okay, we're going to pay these fines, and he pays it. Maybe he even pays out of his own salary. He could do that. The company could decide to accept additional regulations, right? And again, you might have a panel of people who sort of write up what those regulations are, agree to them, and then implement them, right? So the company can atone through the actions of some subset, some members of the company. And so you could think that maybe that's what Jesus is doing for humanity. Humanity as a collective has sinned. That collective owes atonement to God. And Jesus, as a representative of that collective, acts on behalf of that collective to do things that are going to reconcile the collective to God. So I think when you think that way, you avoid a lot of the worries with sort of penal substitutionary views. The earlier element that I mentioned sort of explains why the death is important. And so I think when you take these two parts together, you can start to develop a more plausible theory of atonement.